Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted, episode 54. Now, a lot of you are regulars, but some of you got to this location, this video, by searching the internet, Google, of all things. You probably typed in Woodward and Bernstein, and poof, this popped up. Or you typed in Abbott and Costello, and poof, this popped up. You get what you got. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger, and today is October 26th, 2012.
George, for story one, let's do a little quick update on the Diocese of South Carolina. And to do that, I'm going to do an illustration or an analogy here. And behold the porcupine. Now, you can see it has quills. It's not something you want to approach. If you have a dog and you live here in anywhere in America, and your dog is like a golden retriever or something that's very interested in foreign objects, like my dog Jericho used to be, well, they come home once in a while with quills in the nose. But they only do that once, hopefully. And I remember the day I had to pull quills out of Jericho's nose, and he tried to attack or play with a porcupine. The porcupine has the greatest defense system I can think of. And that is kind of what the Diocese of South Carolina was, because they had written into their constitution a way to protect themselves from anybody attacking their bishop through what we call Title IV in the canons of the Episcopal Church. Now, anybody with a recent history will know that the presiding bishop has brought up many bishops in the Episcopal Church to deposition by using Title IV. And they thought, hey, we can protect our diocese by making it like a porcupine so that nobody will attack us because they would be afraid they would get hurt doing so. Well, what we have now is a porcupine that's been bit. And that's what we see with this chaos going on in the Diocese of South Carolina. They were well protected. They considered themselves indefensible or defensible, and they thought for sure nobody would approach and bite them because the quills would certainly injure the attacker. Well, yes, right now in 815 2nd Avenue, somebody has quills all over her face, but she got a good chunk out of the porcupine, and chaos reigns a little bit in South Carolina.
Kevin, you're absolutely right. South Carolina decided to have cannons stand up like the quills upon the fretful porpentine and serve as a barrier against the depredations of the presiding bishop. But it didn't work. And what we're now seeing is the uncertainty after this very intricate defense mechanism was put into place. After the October 15th notice that the Bishop Lawrence had been suspended from the ministry, he met with his clergy last Friday, and they talked about what happens next. And he explained how the canons worked, and I was in an email conversation with him immediately after the meeting, and he said, "Look, George, I'm just too tired to talk about this right now." And my sense of the situation wasn't that he was discombobulated, wasn't that he didn't know what was going on. It's just that things were evolving so quickly, that he's been receiving so much counsel and information and advice that something he may say on Friday may be out of date by Saturday. So what's happening now is that Bishop Lawrence is going to be going around to the deaneries, I understand, to talk to each of the convocations, and they're going to have a diocesan special convention on November 17th.
Yeah, what's interesting here, and we talked about this last week, is obviously, they didn't expect to be attacked, but everybody else around the world knew this was coming, and we saw that in a letter from the Global South. They wrote their condolences to Mark Lawrence this week and said, hey, we understand what happened, we saw this coming, and in some respect that kind of is a reflection of why nobody else is writing and why the Anglican community is not in a big uproar. You were one of the founding dioceses of the Episcopal Church is kicked out. Is because this is, hey, Catherine Jefferts Schori, this is what she does.
Yeah, we're seeing compassion fatigue from the Global South. Mm-hmm. There's only so much outrage you can muster over the uncanonical, immoral, illegal, and downright mean, those are South Carolina's descriptors, of what Catherine Jefferts Schori has been doing. And, if you've written a letter about San Joaquin, about Pittsburgh, about old Bishop Cox, about Jack Eicher, and nothing changes, and in fact the tempo gets even faster. After a while you just stop getting yourself worked up, and you just turn to prayer and pray for these people who are under attack.
Yeah, I mean, some of the surprise was, oh, wait a minute, there was still conservative diocese left in the Episcopal Church? I mean, at some point you're just thinking, would the last Christian please turn the lights off on the way out? And we're to this point now where right now the Diocese of South Carolina is dealing with a very fluid situation, but they're also in mourning. They have had a death or maybe a divorce from the Episcopal Church, and that is very strange to wake up one morning as a layperson in the diocese and find out you're no longer an Episcopalian, you're not an Anglican because there's no overarching authority over you. Something is wrong, and you're trying to figure out what's going on.
Well, there has been a death. There's been the death of the traditional Episcopal system in South Carolina. For 200 odd years, the Episcopal Church in South Carolina has been sort of the church to be proud of. It's been growing. It has a very high social standing. It was a church whose members stood upon a foundation of Scripture and were proud to be part of this church. And it was a growing, expansive, welcoming church. And now all of a sudden, that vision of who they are has just died. They can never go back now to where they once were, and they're going to be in some sort of degree of warfare with the national church, with other people, with the 12 old people and 2 clergy in nursing homes that say, wait, you're not real Episcopalians, we're Episcopalians. The old way has died.
No.
And nobody's quite shown them what the new birth that they are hoping to be will, what can that be?
Yeah, I mean, you and I can play what now scenarios all day long, but that's not how this works. I think Bishop Mark Lawrence and the Standing Committee are doing the right thing in asking God what next. You know, you want to seek where God is in this, and is God calling the diocese for reconciliation with the Episcopal Church? Is God calling them to a different province? We don't know because that's not George and I's idea to know. It's something that the bishop, the Standing Committee, and the clergy in the diocese has to do as a whole. It's not something news reporters do for you.
Well, speaking of news reporters, if you've been following the secular news lately, there's been this flap about this senatorial candidate in Indiana who tried to talk about theodicy, which is a theory of evil. And the reporters just messed this up. In other words, he was saying that sometimes good can come out of a rape, and he wasn't saying rape was good. He wasn't saying that this was a good thing, but sometimes good can come out of evil. He was trying to make a theological point. Well, he didn't do the best job that he could. But South Carolina is also grappling with that same issue. What good can come out of this evil?
Sure.
And the other issue that they're having to grapple with is, why isn't God operating on our time schedule? Why isn't he doing things before the Anglican Unscripted goes to bed on Friday afternoon before we come out for publication? God is not working to the script.
No,
but the thing is, we need to work. Well, I don't want to get preachy, but we need to work to God's script and not to ours.
Yeah, you don't have to go back too far in the genealogy of Christ to find out that God does not use perfect people and uses evil for good all day long. And we're going to have to keep the diocese in our prayers. And boy, if you're out there in the world, and even though you feel numb to this, and you're like, well, she did it again, please write to the diocese and publish it so the world can know that you're still out there, that you do care about Mark Lawrence and the diocese, and let them hear from you, because this is a time, since time gone on. I remember how important it was that we read the letters at Plano and all the other places, because it brought support and encouragement that people were in prayer for us and they knew what was happening to the injured and victims on the ground. This porcupine will rise again, and it will be a much better creature. Okay, George, let's move here on to story 2. We're going to talk about the Anglican Church in North America and women's ordination. Okay, half of the audience says, well, that's an oxymoron. Women can't be ordained to the priesthood. The other half of our Anglican Unscripted audience says, okay, we're listening. And because of that vast audience we have and the vastness that happened when the Anglican Church was formed, Archbishop Duncan brought into the tent of the Anglican Church of North America the Reformed Episcopal Church, Forward in Faith, many dioceses here in Virginia, like John Guernsey and other places, and Bishop Murdoch. And there's kind of this dual sacristy. Many bishops, hey, it's my word, many bishops are opponents of women's ordination and don't find a clerical role for women in the church. Other diocesan bishops promote it, and some would even think that there'd be nothing wrong with women bishops. And that's actually an argument going on in England right now. And we've come to this point now where Archbishop Duncan is willing to put a task force together and study the issue, which was actually a call put out first by Forward in Faith.
Yes, Forward in Faith, the Diocese of San Joaquin, and several other dioceses had respectfully requested Archbishop Duncan to put together a task force to study the issue of women's ordination. And the appointed Bishop Hicks, an REC bishop, to lead it, and it's begun its work. And I don't know what they expect to get out of this task force.
Well,
now, they want the mandate given to the task force is to provide a theological rationale either for or against, and really thrash out this subject. But is it going to change anybody's minds up at the top levels of the church?
Well, that's the interesting thing is when the Archbishop formed and brought everybody into the tent, there was a lot of trust. And there was trust with the proponents and opponents of women's ordination that when we get together, this is not going to be the issue that divides us as brothers and sisters in Christ. That, you know, let something else do it. But women's ordination won't be that issue. So there was a lot of trust put into that because we're bringing in a tent that, you know, the people who are against women's ordination believe it's, you know, almost a salvation type issue, George, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's those who say that if a woman priest celebrates the sacraments and a person relies upon the validity of those sacraments, and if a woman's orders are void ab initio, they can't even begin because she cannot be a priest by virtue of her being a woman, a person who relies upon the sacraments, Eucharist, for instance, is relying upon a false sacrament, and therefore, in essence, your salvation is imperiled. Now, that's an extreme Anglo-Catholic view, and then we have people on the other side who hold just as strongly held views that for those who deny the validity of women's orders, they're denying the humanity of women, and they have a faulty anthropology of God.
Thus the problem. Okay, so there's a task force now in place with David Hicks, and I think he'll do a wonderful job. But the problem is, once you put this out, is it going to change anything? Even for, you know, it came out that women could not be clergy in the church. What would it change in the Anglican Church of North America? Because written into the canons, it allows for women's ordination under a diocese, not under the whole church itself. And so, would it change anything? And that's my biggest question. I know that this isn't the first time it's been discussed. It's not the first time it's been dealt with. Right now, they're dealing with it in the Church of England, but they're 30 years down the road because in the 1970s, they allowed for women's ordination. Now they're dealing with that troublesome question of whether women can become bishops. Because, George, in my understanding of the structure of the church, any priest can become a bishop.
Yeah, when the big battle was in the early 90s when the issue of women priests was being fought. Mm-hmm. And at that time, opponents of women priests were basically saying, look, theologically, there's not really much of a difference between a woman priest and a woman bishop. If you believe it is ontologically possible for a woman to have the charism of priesthood, having the charism of episcopacy is not a big step forward. So the battle in the Church of England has already been fought and won by those who believe that the charism of priesthood should be held by women, could be held by women. And the battle at this stage is, what safeguards do you have for those who do not accept the office of women priests or bishops? So the conservatives in the ACNA are saying, look, if we're starting the battle we're starting this argument with one arm tied behind our back because we're making an assumption about validity, which is just as valid for the episcopacy, but we're trying to split hairs on this point. And we're seeing people with very strong views who are very articulate on both sides of this issue really hit out at each other. You and I saw this at the ACNA conference in North Carolina this past summer.
Well, yeah, we said one of the virtues of going to these conventions and stuff like that, assemblies, is you get to sit at tables at lunch. And you can, by accident, sit at a pro-women's ordination table or an opponent of women's ordination table, and you get, as a reporter, get your earful. And that's how we know there's an elephant in the room. And right now, George and I are talking about that elephant in the room. Now, the problem the Anglo-Catholics are going to have is they're going to say, you know, like we started with one hand, we started with flying. The Anglican Church in North America started with flying bishops. You know, that was our starting point. Right now, that's, you know, the chasm that the Church of England is struggling is our starting point. Is that really where we want our starting point to be? Other churches have never had to deal with women's ordination, whether it be the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and other churches here, the Protestant churches in America and around the world, embrace it. And both are successful in their own ways.
But politically speaking, this is the reason why the Archbishop of the ACNA, Bob Duncan, needs to stay in office as long as he possibly can. Yeah. Because he's the only one at this level of the discussion who's able to keep everybody on board. Mm. See, one of the things we picked up when we were meeting with supporters and opponents of women's ordination is that both sides feel like persecuted minorities. Nobody feels like they're in control, that the other people are trying to get them. Now, when everybody feels like that, you've got some problems. And Archbishop Duncan has been able to hold people together in what could otherwise be a very fractious environment.
Well, and our apologies to Nara Duncan.
She who must be obeyed.
Yes, she doesn't want to hear that the Archbishop needs to stay on longer, but you know, he really has that ability to keep all the parties at the table and in discussion. And you know, we have, under the Anglican North America tent here, churches that left some 130 years ago the Episcopal Church, and we're eager to come back and be a participant in this growing Anglican thing here in America. Having the Reformed Episcopal Church here is amazing, but they also would be what we call opponents to women's ordination. So you have this mishmash of what do we do now, and even after this task force is finished, will it change the canons and constitution of the Anglican Church in North America? George, there's an Anglican Consultative Council meeting this week, and you and I aren't there. I remember going to the one in Jamaica. That was a lot of fun, but that was my first. You've got quite a streak of these conferences you've gone to. Why aren't you there now?
Well, I've been to every one since 1998, and I'm not there now. And frankly, there's no reason for me to fly halfway around the world to hear 2 weeks on gender violence.
Yeah, that's the great topic, according to Canon Kiernan. A little bit about the ACC. The Anglican Consultative Council is one of the instruments of unity. And when you hear that, you need to hear the word dysfunctional. Because the instruments of unity are Rowan Williams, the Lambeth Conference, the Primates meetings, and the Anglican Consultative Council. All four of those are currently broken because they are not meant to operate as a godly device to communicate to the church how to grow and be effective members of a transforming community in this world. They're there for polity and to act like you little United Nations and put together little common cause issues which really don't mean anything to anybody. And to put this in New Zealand, I mean, it's got Frodo written all over it, and we got a druid at the head. You go crazy. So we've learned that there's really no reason to cover these things because they'll put out their own press releases. Even though they'll discuss the covenant's long dead because they accidentally killed it. And when
They're not going to go into the covenant.
Yeah.
Kenneth Kieran gave a little press statement to some New Zealand newspapers at the start of the meeting saying, oh no, we won't get to the covenant this time around because people are still discussing and voting on it. It would be premature for us to act. So they're not even going to do the covenant, which was dead last time around, courtesy of Rowan Williams.
Yeah. Now, who is the ACC really? Well, they actually want to eventually move to be the standing committee type institutional leader of the Anglican Church. If ever the Archbishop's office becomes defunct like it kind of is now, they want to step into that leadership role. And that's kind of how they put themselves the last 20 years, as they've been growing into a leadership role where they would be the leaders of the Anglican Communion. And so if anybody like Uruguay had a problem, they would say, yes, we'll send some type of Episcopal oversight to you because you and all conservative and liberal dioceses need our help. Right, George?
Sort of.
Sort of?
Before the start of the meeting, the Standing Committee, the Anglican Consultative Council, talked about a number of issues, one of them being the fact that the Episcopal Church cut their subsidy by a third, so they've got less money to do less things, which is probably a good thing overall.
Very good
you need
thing,
to
yes.
starve out the ACC. But one of the things they talk about was a petition from the Diocese of Uruguay that it be allowed to leave the province of the Southern Cone because they're liberals and the rest of the diocese is conservative. And the Standing Committee is talking about that. Now, can you imagine Fort Worth, pick a name, Fort Worth, saying, we would like to leave the Episcopal Church, and the ACC Standing Committee saying, okay, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, right. That'll really, as an REC bishop said about women clergy, hell is going to freeze over first.
And that's the interesting thing is these are just kind of made up organizations that became more and more popular because there was money added to it, and they said, well, we can become something. We can be somebody. We can lead this church because nobody else is. And that's what happens when there's a power vacuum. When the Archbishop of Canterbury won't lead the church, somebody else will step in. When the primates are dethroned and the Archbishop won't let them lead the church, this power vacuum opens up a way for the ACC to move in. When Lambeth is made into one chaotic meeting of Indaba, it allows places like the ACC to move in and say, we'll take charge. You can trust us. We don't do anything bad. Just send us your money and we'll go to nice places like New Zealand.
Well, it's part of what I call thoughtlessness, the whole thoughtlessness of a London-oriented, London-centered idea of Anglicanism. Now, New Zealand, from a London perspective, that's exotic. That's the third world. When reality, it's not.
No.
It's just a little bit of England that happened to drift all the way to the South Pacific. Problem when you hold things in New Zealand is that it's very far away, it's very expensive, and, oh, by the way, delegates from the Sudan and Ghana can't go there because they can't get visas to be allowed in there. So guess whose voices on the ACC Standing Committee aren't being heard this time around? All the Africans.
Yeah.
Why? They're not allowed in New Zealand. Do you think the ACC would have thought about that before scheduling it in New Zealand?
Oh, I'm sure they did.
You're right. I guess you're right.
How do we finally get the African voice out of our church? And we go to places they can't go. And there's a strategy that you and I would just as reporters say, oh, look, they oopsed again. Well, I think at this point we've seen enough oopsing to know that there's really a strategy behind trying to take control of the Anglican Church. Now, here's the ironic thing and the paradox behind all this, is by the time they finally muster control of the Anglican Church, there's no church left. The Episcopal Church has fallen apart. The churches in Europe have fallen apart. The only thing left is the Global South and GAFCON. And so, at the end of the day, Canon Kenneth Kiernan and presiding boy, it's the English is my second language. Presiding Bishop Jeffrey Shorey and her Metropolitan Cross are powerful over nothing. And that's the sad thing is they found a way to destroy a church, a communion, and the love of Jesus.
You remember 2005, the Episcopal Church was told it had to go into a period of exile because of all the bad things it had done.
Sure.
Well, it continues to do those bad things, and oh, well, that period of exile is over. You've learned your lesson, so why don't you, so we're not going to complain now that you've introduced gay marriage into the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, that's
Or we're not going to allow any Episcopalians on ecumenical commissions. Rowan Williams has come up with that solution so as to honor the requests of the Global South. So what do? They still have Americans on all these commissions, but they're called consultants, not delegates.
Yeah. So that's, George and I are bringing you the open eye of what the ACC is and why we're not there. Hey, it would have been fun to go to New Zealand and check out the makings of the 3 rings and stuff like that, but you know, this is a different world, and we spend our money more wisely, donated money, that is.
You know, the Ugandans came to the same decision.
Yeah.
The Church of Uganda is boycotting the ACC meeting. They felt that the cost for them to fly 3 people halfway around the world for 2 weeks was not worth the investment.
Yeah.
Then the ACC said, well, we'll help you pay for it. And Uganda said, no, we really have better things to do with our time, which is winning souls for Christ, not with gender violence.
Amen. Now, if you watch the first 3 stories of this week's episode, you're like, you know, depressing. Why are we watching anything unscripted? You guys are a bummer. Well, we can also bring you good news with a bad story. Ooh, kind of goes back to our first story. So the good news is, sometimes in a persecuted church, there are victories for Christians. And I'm going to talk to you about the Eastern African persecuted church in Zanzibar and stuff like that. You would have saw, if you watched last week's episode 53, I did an interview with a person called Father K. And Father K and his family are missionaries in East Africa. They had to flee their location because of acute Muslim violence that had erupted where they were, and they had to leave and go to a safe location for a couple days. For those who are concerned, they're now back at their ministry location and doing the Lord's work. In Africa, there is now the model of Christian versus Muslim that wasn't there even 6 years ago when you and I went to the primates meeting in Tanzania. I remember my cab driver was a Muslim and his wife was a Christian, and I had many conversations with him about the growth of Islam in Tanzania. He said, not a big deal. You know, half the country's Christian, half the country's Muslim. We live in happiness and peace. There's no violence. You never read about any violence. It's not going to happen in Tanzania. Now, some 6 years later, Tanzania is being torn apart by Islamic fundamentalists and Christian violence, which is really going back and forth. The Christians are completely innocent in this, and there's a problem where all of East Africa is getting caught up on this. Some of the good news. Tell me about Boko Haram.
Well, if we jump over to West Africa, to Nigeria, Boko Haram, which is a militant Islamic group based in the north of the country, has been waging war on the country's government and its Christian population. They've announced that all Christians must leave northern Nigeria, and if you don't leave, we'll kill you. And last month, they went into a student dormitory at a university in northeastern Nigeria, and they pulled 40 men out of the dormitory, and they killed them. And what did these 40 men have in common? They were Christians. Well, the leader of Boko Haram was captured by the Nigerian police last week. And hopefully, we'll see beginning of the end to this pogrom against Christians that is seeking to kill people and to break up the Republic of Nigeria.
Now, here on the West, we deal with heresy and the persecuted church. When we think of persecution, we think of people being kicked out of their churches. We think about people losing property, ending up on court dockets, being sued by your bishop or being sued by your presiding bishop, having to fork out money for lawyers. That to us is persecution. Over in the Middle East and Africa and other places, persecution is different. Persecution involves people losing their lives. There are places like Zimbabwe where they actually lose property though too.
Yeah, and Zimbabwe is not a Muslim-Christian issue. Zimbabwe is an issue of good versus evil. It's that basic. The former Bishop of Harare, Dr. Nolbert Kanunga, who, by the way, is a Northwestern University grad, that's where he got his PhD, broke with the Anglican Church there, and with the backing of the government of Robert Mugabe, the dictator of that country, he took over and kept all the dioceses of Harare's properties. And he would bring in the secret police, the security services, and into churches. And unless you backed him and his appointees, you'd be driven out with bullwhips. Well, actually, they call them sandbox. They're hippo hide short whips that they would beat the people to leave the church, beat the clergy who were loyal to the Anglican Church. And there'd been a series of lawsuits, and this past week, Dr. Kanunga lost. He lost 5 of the 7 lawsuits, and 2 of them have yet to be decided. But if the police honor the court rulings, the Anglicans of Zimbabwe are going to get their churches back from a very evil man.
Yeah, which is interesting. Now, I've noticed last week that our audience, we have a global audience. It used to be 70% American, 30% foreign. It's kind of reversed. We're now 40% domestic to North America, and the rest of the world's watching. We had a 25% increase in India viewership last week. Let's do a quick India story.
Well, we've been covering in Anglican Inc. The situation in the churches of North and South India. They've got a real problem with corruption. In fact, one of the jokes Kevin and I have is that each week he says, well, what's happening in the world? I said, well, there's another Indian bishop who's got a corruption problem. And, you know, that's sort of like saying there's another Episcopal bishop who's being deposed for breaking with Catherine Jefferts Schori. After a while, you got to move on to a new story. Well, last month, a sitting bishop in North India was arrested by the police, and a number of other bishops are being asked to help the police with their inquiries, which is a quite polite way of saying they're on the run and the police are looking for them, because these guys tried to sell some old British colonial churches that are now in prime downtown real estate in Bombay to developers and keep the money. The Indian church has got a problem with corruption in its upper reaches, while the people on the ground are sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with their Muslim and Hindu neighbors. They're being persecuted by Muslim and Hindu extremists, while some of the bishops, not all, but by last count, 2/3 of the South Indian bishops have had corruption problems, are pocketing the money of the people in the pews.
Yeah, and that's just a sample of what goes around the world. From extreme violence to people losing churches to the corruption with money. It's a broken church, but it's a church led by somebody who's unbroken. That's Jesus Christ. I have on the other line my good friend Peter Old, and we're going to talk about what we always talk about, women bishops and
bishops, yes.
And the fraud going on in the Church of England. It was in the mid-70s that you guys really started to have women's ordinations, and it started to move through the Church of England. It was part of the new British culture. And now it's to the point where the women are like, we're priests, why can't we be bishops?
Yeah.
And that's the greatest argument going is, if you're a priest, argument. You can be a bishop. Now Rowan has really kind of pushed the ball to where he wants to go to.
Yeah, this is now make or break. The revision committee, which, as you know, had to look again at the clause looking after traditionalists, has come back with its proposal. It's actually a proposal from a great female priest up north in England. So it's known as the Appleby Clause now, named after her, Appleby Clause.
Sure.
And that's now being pushed forward. Synod is going to meet for a special session just looking at this in a few weeks' time. And the game is now on. So we've got a wonderful video from the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's basically saying now is the time to do it. We've got to do it. Bishop Stephen Cottrell of Chelmsford, fairly liberal, has done one. Bishop Pete Broadbent of Willesden, he's one of the suffragan bishops in London. Good, strong, evangelical, but in favour of women bishops, has done a video. So there's a strong, concerted campaign now to make this pass. The usual traditionalist groups, so Church Society, Reform, Forward and Faith, have come out now and basically said what's on the table will not work for us. We're not going to abstain. We're going to vote against. There's very likely to be quite a few people who are in favour of women bishops but want adequate protection for traditionalists who will vote against as well. So it's all now down to the wire, really.
Yeah, it's down to the wire. I mean, we've had, over the last 6-7 years, a lot of Anglicans going to the Roman Catholic Church over issues like this. Is this going to really take the remainder of the Forward and Faith type community and put them into a place where they're just going to leave the Church of England?
I'm not sure. A lot of the Forward and Faith people left to the Ordinariate, and I think a lot of the people who would have wanted to go to Rome have done that. The Pope's made it basically as easy as it can be for them to do that. I think some will jump ship if this goes through. There's a question for conservative evangelicals as to what they will do, because obviously going off to Rome and signing up to marry and the dogmas and purgatory might not work out for them. So, what will they do as a constituency? Is there enough in the Act and the Code of Practice to support them? We'll have to wait and see. But we will have to wait and see if this thing actually passes. I still think the numbers are very tight. And the fact that all these videos and this campaign is now starting to make it happen means that those who are in favour are worried that it will not happen.
Well, I see that we have Rowan Williams doing the videos.
Yep.
We also saw a statement now from Fulcrum saying that, hey, there's nothing wrong with this, and we'll go forward with whatever the Church of England decides.
And that's no surprise, because Fulcrum have always had as part of their mission statement the fact that they see women as equal members in the three orders of ordination. And so they've been pushing for this for a long time. There is a sense amongst some of the proponents of this that what we have now is the best it could be, and we need to go for it. But as I said before, there are a lot of people who are not happy, don't think there's sufficient protection for traditionalists. The whole language now in the act of respecting the view of the traditionalists leaves enough ambiguity as to what that means. Does that mean you go, well, yes, I respect that you have that position, but you're wrong, so I'm going to impose my will on you? There's too much ambiguity, so people are going to vote against.
One of the first bishops I ever met when I traveled to England for the Lambeth conference, he goes, Kevin Carlson from AnglicanTV, I'm so-and-so, and I'm a flying bishop.
Flying bishop!
And I'm like, well, boy, what's a flying bishop? And that was my introduction to people. The results of women's ordination in the Church of England was to allow something like that. Something like that's not really going to be allowed in the new transition to women bishops.
Absolutely. The model that they are thinking of is to appoint specific individual bishops who will be like the flying bishops, but not quite as powerful, and they will have the pastoral care of the congregations that dissent. But the sample code of practice that they've drawn up, it all just looks a bit kind of ambiguous. Could a female diocesan basically go, well, I'm just going to give you this male bishop here, who doesn't actually agree with you, but hey, he's got a penis, so that's okay, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the concerns of the traditionalists, that they need to have a bishop who is a proper bishop, who they can respect, who shares their concerns, and who they can go to finally, rather than the diocesan bishop, because at the moment the parishes who dissent, who have these flying bishops, who you can spot because they've got big S on their coat.
Yes.
Most dioceses pretty well leave those parishes to themselves and let them get on and don't try to interfere with them. The concern is that that's all going to break down.
Well, I was looking over my Peter Old betting sheet, and up to this point, every time you said it would not pass, it has not passed. And we've had this conversation, I think, 4 times. And I said, I think it's going to pass this time. And Peter's like, no, it's not going to pass. Okay, so what are the odds now for it passing here in November?
I really don't know.
Ooh.
I think, Kevin, I think it's like November the 6th over your end. I actually think we won't know until the night.
Okay,
I think, I think.
It's called even odds.
Yeah, it's pretty either way. It's pretty close.
All right. Well, I will give you a call that day, and we'll certainly have a grand discussion. Probably talk to some flying bishops as well. Thank you. You're going on holiday now too, right?
I'm going on holiday. Yay! I'm away for a week.
Take your laptop with you just in case.
Yeah.
Right.
That's not going to happen. My wife would kill me if I take my laptop with me on holiday.
I have the same problem.
Yeah.
It's time for our legal segment with Alan Haley, and we're going to talk about what's been going on the last week in the church. If you remember, almost 7 days ago, our good friend George Conger broke the story about what was happening behind the scenes with the disciplinary committee, Title IV, and I guess we still call it the Fort Worth 7 and the Quincy 3.
If we're talking bishops, yes.
Yes, I mean it's a crazy world, but if the audience may recall, right around General Convention, there was a lot of conflict and stuff going on between the House of Bishops and Mark Lawrence, and then there was charges brought up with Ed Salmon and what we'll call the Diosis of Fort Worth 7 and the Quincy 3. And these are people who filed amicus briefs in court proceedings, one in Quincy and one in Fort Worth, and that was not appreciated by other House of Bishops members and some lay people from the diocese and clergy from the diocese of these places, and they brought up charges against these bishops. What's happened now this week?
Okay, well, first of all, we have to distinguish. In Quincy, there are 3 there did not submit any kind of an amicus brief. That case is still down at the trial level. It hasn't gone up on appeal yet, and trial is next spring. They simply submitted declarations or affidavits of sworn testimony in that case, supporting the position of the Quincy diocese that had withdrawn from the Episcopal Church. In Fort Worth, it was an amicus brief in the case there before the Texas Supreme Court that was argued just last week. And the brief was filed on behalf of, well, it was the 7 bishops plus 3 priests and the Anglican Communion Institute. And they had an unusual argument, which was that the polity of the Episcopal Church is hierarchical, but it stops at the diocesan level. And it's not hierarchical at the national level, but to get into that question would itself run afoul of the First Amendment and involve the courts, civil courts, in very religious disputes. So their amicus brief simply argued that the court should, if it stays with what it's called the old deference standard, that it should not get involved in the question of whether TEC is hierarchical and simply leave it to Bishop Eicher as the highest ecclesiastical authority with authority to pronounce on the Constitution and canons in the diocese to sort things out. And of course, that was not a popular argument with the whole and the faux diocese of Fort Worth, nor was it popular with the presiding bishop. So charges were brought, and we thought they'd all been resolved. But then this last week, the 7 bishops of Fort Worth and the 3 of Quincy, and one of them, by the way, is on both of those groups, Bishop McPherson, did both things. Were informed by Clayton Matthews, who is the intake officer for the disciplinary board for bishops under the new Title IV, that they would their case had gone to the reference panel. I'll get to that in a minute. And the reference panel had recommended that the whole matter go to conciliation, which is a procedure under the new disciplinary canons that hopefully brings both sides together in an informal setting under the auspices of a conciliator, and who's an outside person skilled in mediation. And he tries to bring them together, and they are supposed to come out of the process with what's called an accord. And an accord is a formal resolution of the dispute that one party maybe apologizes and agrees never to do this sort of thing again, and then the parties go their way. So the interesting thing here is, first of all, what's this reference panel and who's on it that has simply decided how this case will be handled?
Wait, you're saying there may be people who have a conflict of interest? Is that your hint here?
Kangaroo court here or not. The reference panel consists of just 3 people. It's Dorsey Henderson, who is the retired Bishop of Upper South Carolina, who is the president of the disciplinary board and who served on the committee that wrote the new Title IV canons. We have Clayton Matthews, who is the intake officer, as I mentioned, who is the person who initially judges all charges that come in and decide if they're sufficient to go further. And he obviously made that judgment in this case. And then we have the presiding bishop herself, is the 3rd member of this reference panel, who has an obvious interest in these things, having filed her own amicus brief in the Fort Worth case. So nobody is disciplining the presiding bishop for filing an amicus brief in the Fort Worth case. And also there were 4 other bishops from Texas, Lillibridge and Doyle and Ole and Vono, who filed another amicus brief in the Fort Worth case. And you don't hear about any disciplinary charges being brought against them either.
Well, so that proves the fact that filing an amicus brief in and of itself is not a violation of canon law and will not have you brought up on charges. So therefore, this becomes a freedom of speech issue rather than a filing of an amicus brief issue.
Exactly. We would like to know, since when did it become illegal or uncanonical to disagree with the presiding bishop's view of the polity of the Episcopal Church?
Oh, that was in 2006, if you want to know the exact date.
That's right. We shifted from a church with a presiding bishop who presided over the meetings of General Convention in the House of Bishops to a church that was metropolitical with a total absolute authority sitting at the top saying everything, what happens and what's true and what's right and what's wrong and so on. That's right.
Well, we mentioned kangaroo courts before. Now, we're in a position here where this isn't going to be handled in civilian courts. This is something that happens within the church. So any real legal footstools that these bishops would have to stand on really doesn't exist because we're in Title IV.
Right. And it's going to be an interesting question. First thing to do is to deal with all these conflicts of interest, because these bishops have the right to challenge the members of the reference panel and the members of the disciplinary board for bias or conflict of interest. It's right there in the Title IV canons. And they should have recused themselves by now. The main reason why they the bishops anyway, should have recused themselves is that they were all participated in those private sessions at the House of Bishops during General Convention trying to reconcile this matter, and they spoke to each other very frankly and shared their deepest views about things. And so all of those bishops who are now joining in the prosecution of the Fort Worth 7 shared and had intimate factual knowledge that they couldn't have otherwise gained by any other means. And one of the grounds for disqualifying people on the disciplinary board, again written right there in the canons, is if the person cannot be impartial by reason of having gained personal knowledge of the matter in dispute. So there should be no question here that all these people, the presiding bishop, Henderson, and I don't know if Henderson was at General Convention or not, but he certainly authored the Title IV canons and is propounds this view of the Episcopal Church as metropolitical now under its new bishop. And then Clayton Matthews, who was there at the time, so participated in the session. So they should all step down. And if there's any remaining members of the disciplinary board for bishops, as I say, there's 10 bishops and 8 people, 8 others, 4 from the clergy and 4 laity. And if there's any of them who do not have any stake in this matter, who did not participate in or gain any particular knowledge, then they will have to decide who is not biased and could remain in judgment in this matter. It's going to be, a problem is that I see until they get these conflicts resolved, and the bishops, as I say, have every right to challenge them and get this matter determined. I don't see how things can move forward.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, conflict of interest in legalities, because one of the first things a court tries to do is differentiate who's overly biased and should not be held on a jury, for instance. You, as a layperson, would not bring charges against Catherine Jefferts Schori because you serve as a legal counsel to a defendant against her. And so that's a conflict of interest that you have no trouble dividing that line, but somehow once you get over here in New York and on the East Coast, that conflict of interest line is invisible.
It just goes away, and everything's, as I say, in favor of this pre-programmed plan to bring this about. You know, the conciliation that they're talking about, I can't see what the point of it would be unless they're trying to exact a pledge from all these dissenting bishops never to do this again. And that would silence a whole wing of the Episcopal Church that has the right to speak up in court when they're asked about their views of what the structure of the church is. So this is another attempt, as I say, just to silence the opponents and use all fronts, regardless of the conflicts.
Well, my problem here is, why don't the bishops who are accused get to choose whether or not it's conciliatory?
Yeah.
That's the biggest conflict I see here is, oh, by the way, we're going to bring you up on charges, and this is the route we're taking.
Yeah, and they also informed that over the next couple of days, Bishop Matthews plans to consult with the presiding bishop, who will select certain members of the House of Bishops to participate in the process, and who will also consult with the complainants about who the conciliator should be. But, of course, the respondents aren't consulted on this. They're just simply told. And it's going to be, I mean, the whole procedure here just reeks of what we out west used to call the kangaroo courts of rough justice on the mining claims. And, everybody thinks the expression came from Australia, but no, it was because the weirdness of the kangaroo as he jumps around and takes quick leaps here and there. These courts didn't bother with the niceties of procedure or detail. They just went right to the result that they wanted. And so the phrase caught on and became very popular. And it applies in spades here because, as I say, and as you noted, we attorneys deal with conflicts of interest all the time. We're trained on how to recognize them and how to recuse ourselves when a conflict applies and we can't represent more than one person. And also another great maxim that applies here, and it's been with us ever since the times of Solomon, is that no man shall be judge of his own cause. And
definitely, yeah.
Here we have the presiding bishop sitting in judgment. She's going to be the judge, jury, and executioner in this matter, when it's her own view of the Episcopal Church that is being disputed. So she gets to state her views, and then she gets to sit in judgment and, pass sentence upon or otherwise guide the discipline of the people who disagree with her. It's unheard of, and it's unbiblical. It's unlegal.
but it seems to be very Episcopal.
A lot come to be the meaning of Episcopal. Anything, it used to be said. There was a great saying in French. Let's see, "Ce qui n'est pas logique n'est pas français." That which is not logical is not French. Well, now we have a saying which is that which is illegal, void, unbiblical, unscriptural is Episcopal.
I can't do any better than that. That closes our legal segment with Alan Haley. Okay, George, let's close out episode 54. I'm reading through some of this ENS stuff, the Episcopal News Service, and we made the news, George.
Oh, it was rather funny, really, in a silly sort of way. Anglican Inc., our sister site, where we have some original news stories that we bring to our readers, broke a story earlier this week about the Disciplinary Board for Bishops, the DBB, the topic of Alan Haley and your conversation. And we reported on how the Fort Worth 9, or the Fort Worth 7 and the Quincy 3, which added together make the Fort Worth 9, because one of them appears in both lists. Now, if you got that so far, you're farther ahead than I am.
Yeah, wow.
Well, we broke that story. And now it's Friday, 5 days later, and the Episcopal News Service has picked up that story. But unfortunately for the Episcopal News Service, the 815 is not being helpful. So they've had to quote us. And they've quoted us with such you could almost see them like, ooh, cooties, Kevin and George, ew, because they say, I'll read it to you, according to information circulating on some blogs. And then they take all of our original material. That's how they reference to us, some blog.
Quick update, I'm flying to Denver, Colorado for the Pair USA inaugural event. I'll be bringing you interviews and live streaming. If you want to go to AnglicanTV/live, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you can watch the assembly there. I'm flying then November 17th. I'm going to the special convention at Charleston, South Carolina, where the diocese will be hopefully forming a way forward after their porcupine got bit. I'm some Kevin.
And I'm some blogger, George Conger, and you've been watching episode 54 of Anglican Unscripted.
Boy across the street can't even speak today. It's not Friday. It's not like, English isn't my first language. It's really your first language.
2 countries divided by a common language.
It's us. 3, 2, 1.